The aroma of spices and fresh flowers filled the air, welcoming a new day. Among boxes and counters, a four-legged friend made his triumphant entrance, drawing curious glances. With an improvised gift between his teeth, he seemed to know exactly how to provoke smiles. And so, an unlikely friendship began to write a new story in the heart of the market. Before listening to this exciting story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The sun had barely peeked over the cobblestone streets of Green Street Market when Jack Miller lifted the metal shutter of his butcher shop. The familiar screech of rusted metal mingled with the first calls of street vendors, creating that unique symphony that only American markets can orchestrate. At 45, Jack had inherited the business from his father, who in turn had received it from his grandfather. The walls of the shop, stained by decades of stories and the persistent aroma of spices, held the secrets of 3 generations of butchers who had served the community with dedication and honesty. As he arranged the fresh cuts on the counter, following the daily ritual he knew by heart, Jack reflected on the loneliness that had accompanied him since the death of his wife Sarah 5 years ago. They hadn't had children, and although the hustle and bustle of the market filled his days, the nights in his small apartment above the butcher shop felt especially empty. The tinkling of the doorbell pulled him from his thoughts. It was early for customers, he thought, turning to greet, but there was no one. Only then did he notice a movement at knee height. A medium-sized dog, with golden fur stained by the dust of the streets, looked at him with intelligent and expectant eyes. In his mouth he held a dry branch as if it were the most valuable of treasures. "And you, friend?" Jack murmured, leaning slightly. The dog took a step forward, gently dropped the branch on the floor, and stepped back, keeping his gaze fixed on the butcher. There was something in those brown eyes that conveyed an ancient wisdom, an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. Jack observed the branch. It was from the jacaranda tree that grew in the central square, recognizable by its particular texture. The dog continued to sit, patient, as if following an invisible trade protocol that only he knew. "Are you trying to buy something?" The question escaped his lips before he could contain it, and for a moment he felt foolish for talking to an animal, but the dog tilted his head as if he perfectly understood the question. Without thinking too much, Jack went to the counter and cut a small piece of meat. It wasn't an expensive cut, but it was fresh and would be a feast for any stray dog. When he offered it, the animal took it with surprising gentleness, as if wanting to demonstrate that he was worthy of the trust placed in him. "Come back whenever you want," Jack said, surprising himself again by speaking to him like any other customer. The dog, which he would later know as Max, wagged his tail in gratitude and left the shop with a calm step, carrying his prize with dignity. That first encounter, seemingly casual, would mark the beginning of a transformation in Jack's life. The following days, at the same time, the dog returned, always with a different branch, always with the same intelligent look and polite behavior. The news began to circulate around the market. The other merchants peeked curiously to witness the peculiar exchange. Mrs. Thompson, the florist from the neighboring stall, was the first to capture the moment with her cell phone when the dog was performing his now ritual transaction. "Jack, this is incredible," the woman exclaimed as she recorded. "It's as if he understood the concept of trade." And so, without intending to, Jack's daily routine began to change. Customers came not only for the quality of his meat, but also in the hope of witnessing the visit of the dog who paid with branches. Some even began to leave small donations to help feed the peculiar customer. But there was something more in all this that intrigued Jack. He observed that the branches Max brought were not random. They all came from the same type of tree, all had similar characteristics. As a third-generation butcher, Jack had learned to trust his instincts, and something told him there was more to this story than met the eye. One afternoon, as he was closing the shop, he noticed that Max wasn't leaving as usual. The dog stopped at the corner, looking back, as if waiting for Jack to follow him. It was at that moment when the butcher made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would follow Max to discover the mystery behind his daily visits. What Jack didn't know was that he was about to embark on an adventure that would not only transform his own existence, but would impact the lives of the entire Green Street Market community, revealing secrets buried by time and awakening a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. The decision to follow Max that afternoon marked the beginning of a discovery that Jack could never have imagined. The sun was beginning to set behind the buildings of the historic downtown, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as the butcher discreetly followed the dog through the cobblestone streets. Max walked with determination, as if he knew exactly his destination. He turned at precise corners, crossed narrow alleys, and occasionally stopped to make sure Jack was following him. The journey took them beyond the familiar limits of the market to a less traveled area of the city. After almost half an hour of walking, they arrived at an abandoned park. The rusty gate creaked in the wind and weeds had invaded much of the ground. The children's playground equipment, silent witnesses of better times, stood like metal skeletons among the neglected vegetation. Max stopped in front of an old jacaranda tree, the same type from which all the branches he had brought to the butcher shop came. But what Jack saw next chilled his blood. Underneath the tree, in a natural hollow formed between the roots, were 5 puppies, all visibly weak and hungry. "So this was your secret," Jack murmured, suddenly understanding the dog's daily urgency to get food. The puppies, seeing Max, immediately perked up, but they were cautious in the presence of the stranger. Max approached Jack and looked at him with those eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the world. It was as if he was saying, "Now you understand, don't you?" The butcher slowly crouched down, extending his hand so the puppies could sniff him. "Don't worry, friend," Jack said, addressing Max. "We'll help them." In the days that followed, Jack's routine changed completely. He began to save more meat scraps for Max and his puppies, and he started visiting the park after work to bring them fresh water and make sure they were okay. The story of the dog who paid with branches had already gone viral on social media, thanks to the video Mrs. Thompson had shared. Local journalists began to appear at the butcher shop, eager to capture the peculiar story of the butcher and his canine customer. "It's incredible how an animal can show so much intelligence and dedication," commented a reporter during an interview. "How did you come up with the idea of accepting branches as a form of payment?" Jack smiled, keeping Max's true secret to himself. "Some customers pay with money, others with branches. The important thing is the intention," he responded diplomatically. However, the growing media attention brought unexpected consequences. Other stray dogs, attracted by the smell of meat and possibly imitating Max, began to appear at the butcher shop. Some brought leaves, others small stones, and some simply sat waiting patiently. The situation began to worry some of the market neighbors. Mr. Johnson, the owner of the vegetable stand, was the first to express his concern. "Jack, I understand your good intention, but this is getting out of control," he warned one morning. "The health inspectors won't look kindly on so many stray dogs near the food businesses." And he was right. It wasn't long before the health authorities made a surprise visit to the butcher shop. The inspector, a man with a severe face and clipboard in hand, observed with disapproval the paw prints on the floor of the shop. "Mr. Miller, this violates several health codes," declared the official as he took notes. "If the situation is not corrected, I will be forced to close the establishment." The news fell like a bucket of cold water on Jack. The butcher shop was not only his livelihood, it was his family heritage, the legacy of 3 generations. But he also couldn't abandon Max and his puppies to their fate. As he contemplated his options that night, sitting on the back steps of his shop, an elegantly dressed man approached. His suit contrasted with the simple atmosphere of the market, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Miller," said the stranger, extending a business card. "I've been following your story in the news. I have a proposal that might interest you." What Jack didn't know was that this conversation would mark the beginning of a series of events that would test not only his determination, but also his understanding of the true meaning of loyalty and the value of the most unexpected connections. The man in the elegant suit introduced himself as Richard Walker, a supposed entrepreneur dedicated to professional canine training. His card, printed on expensive paper, shimmered under the dim light of the evening. "I've been observing your dog, Mr. Miller," Richard began, adjusting his tie. "He's an exceptional specimen. His intelligence and learning capacity are extraordinary. I'm willing to offer you a considerable sum for him." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way this man talked about Max, as if he were a commodity that caused him deep unease. "Max is not for sale," he responded dryly. "Besides, technically he's not my dog." Richard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Mr. Miller, everyone has a price. Think about your problems with health department." $50,000 could help you modernize your shop, comply with regulations. The offer hung in the air, but Jack didn't even consider it. I appreciate your interest, but the answer is still no. As he watched the businessman walk away, Jack noticed that Max had silently appeared by his side, growling softly. It was the first time he had seen him show any sign of aggression. Curiosity got the better of prudence. That night, after closing the butcher shop, Jack decided to investigate Richard Walker on the internet. What he discovered chilled his blood. Several forums and animal protection groups linked him to illegal dog fights on the outskirts of the city. The following days passed with palpable tension. Jack noticed a black car frequently parked near his shop and occasionally saw unknown men photographing Max during his daily visits. The situation worsened when other merchants in the market began to receive similar visits. Mrs. Thompson was the first to warn him. "Jack, yesterday a man came asking about your schedules, about your routines," the florist confided with concern. "He didn't give me a good feeling." The market community, which had initially been divided regarding the dog situation, began to unite around Jack. Mr. Johnson, who had complained before, now kept a watchful eye from his vegetable stand. The vendors took turns warning each other about the presence of suspicious strangers. Meanwhile, Max's fame continued to grow. A local journalist did a more in-depth report, highlighting how the dog had inspired a movement of solidarity in the market. Other merchants had begun to leave water and food for the stray dogs, and some had even adopted a few. One afternoon, as Jack was closing the shop, he heard a commotion in the street. When he went out, he found Max facing two men who were trying to catch him with a net. Without thinking twice, Jack ran towards them. "Leave him alone!" he shouted, while other merchants came out of their shops upon hearing the scandal. The men, finding themselves discovered and surrounded by an increasingly large crowd, fled in the same black car that Jack had been seeing in recent days. That incident was a turning point. The market community gathered that same night in Jack's shop to discuss the situation. Mr. Johnson, surprising everyone, was the one who spoke up. "What we need is to get organized. If these guys want war, we'll give them war." The proposal was unanimous. They would create a community surveillance system. The vendors would take turns keeping an eye on Max and the other dogs in the market. Additionally, several offered to install additional security cameras. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Thompson revealed something she had been keeping. "Jack, there's something you should know about this market and about Max," the old woman said with a trembling voice. "Your grandfather, he didn't just found the butcher shop. There's a story that few know, a story that has to do with that abandoned park where Max protects his puppies." The eyes of all those present were fixed on the florist as she prepared to reveal a secret that would change Jack's perspective on his own family history and the true reason why Max had chosen his butcher shop. The silence in the butcher shop was absolute as Mrs. Thompson, with trembling hands, took an old and yellowed photograph from her purse. The image showed the market in its early days, when the streets were not yet paved and automobiles were a rarity. "Your grandfather, Anthony Miller, wasn't just a butcher," Mrs. Thompson began, pointing to a young man in the photograph. "He was one of the founders of this market, and he had a special love for animals. In those days, this place was very different." The old woman explained how the current abandoned park, where Max cared for his puppies, had originally been a shelter for stray animals founded by Anthony Miller. The place operated in parallel with the market, and the merchants contributed food scraps to maintain the animals. "Your grandfather had a dog," Mrs. Thompson continued, taking out another photograph. "His name was Captain, and he was identical to Max. So identical that when I first saw him, I thought I was seeing a ghost." Jack took the photograph with trembling hands. It was true. The resemblance between Captain and Max was astonishing. The same golden fur, the same white spot on the chest, even the same intelligent look. "But there's more," added the florist. "Your grandfather kept important documents in a metal box. He buried it in the park when problems started with the authorities who wanted to close the shelter. He always said that someday, when the time was right, someone would find that box." Mr. Johnson, who had remained silent, intervened. "That's why the branches Max brings are always from the same tree. It must be the tree under which the box is buried." The revelation hit Jack like a wave. Max's visits, his behavior, the specific choice of branches, everything was starting to make sense. "But how could Max know about a box buried decades ago?" asked one of the merchants present. "Dogs have a connection to the past that we can't understand," Mrs. Thompson responded. "And this market has more history than we imagine." That same night, after everyone had left, Jack stayed awake reviewing old boxes he kept in the attic of his house. Among dusty papers and family memories, he found his grandfather's diary. The yellowed pages revealed Anthony's passion for animals and his struggle to keep the shelter open. The last entry in the diary, dated shortly before his death, contained a cryptic message: "When the Guardian returns, the roots will reveal the treasure. The truth about this place must be preserved." The next day, Max didn't appear at his usual time. Jack, worried, closed the butcher shop early and headed to the abandoned park. The sun was beginning to set when he arrived at the place and found Max digging frantically under the old jacaranda tree. The puppies watched from their shelter as Jack approached. Max stopped, staring at him as if he had been waiting for this moment. In the hole he had dug, something metallic gleamed under the earth. With his heart racing, Jack knelt down and began to dig with his own hands. Little by little, a rusty metal box emerged from the earth. The lid was sealed, but time had weakened the metal. Inside the box, protected by an aged leather bag, he found documents that would change the fate of the market. The original property title of the land, historical photographs, and a contract that established the market as a cooperative protected by special statutes. But the most surprising thing was finding a photograph of his grandfather with Captain, sitting exactly in the same place where he and Max were now. On the back, in faded handwriting, it read, "The Guardian will return when needed. Blood calls to blood." Jack looked at Max, who was watching him with those wise and ancient eyes. Was it possible that this dog was more than just a coincidence? Was there something deeper in this connection between past and present? The answer to these questions would come soon, along with a series of events that would test not only Jack's determination, but the strength of an entire community united by a common purpose. The documents found in the metal box turned out to be more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Among the yellowed papers, Jack discovered that Green Street Market had been established as a cooperative, protected by special statutes that prevented its sale or demolition without the unanimous consent of all the original merchants and their heirs. While Jack studied the documents in his butcher shop, with Max faithfully sitting by his side, the doorbell rang. Richard Walker entered, this time accompanied by two men in suits and a woman who introduced herself as a representative from the Urban Development Department. "Mr. Miller," the woman began, adjusting her glasses, "we have a sanitary and structural inspection order for the market. Worrying reports have come in about the presence of stray animals and non-compliance with basic regulations." Jack noticed how Richard smiled discreetly in the background. It was evident that this was not a simple routine inspection. Additionally, the official continued, there is an urban renewal project that requires the relocation of the market. The landowners have agreed to the sale. The landowners? Jack smiled for the first time since they entered. "I think you should review your documents better." Taking out the newly discovered papers, Jack explained the true legal situation of the market. The official, visibly surprised, examined the documents with growing concern. This changes things," she murmured, casting an uncomfortable look towards Richard. The businessman, however, didn't give up. "Those documents will have to be verified. Meanwhile, the sanitary issue still stands. Stray dogs are a public health risk." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Max got up and walked towards the back door of the butcher shop. Jack followed him, and the others, intrigued, did the same. In the back alley of the market, where there were usually only empty boxes and garbage containers, there was now a surprising scene. Several of the stray dogs that frequented the market were sitting in an organized manner as if mounting guard. Among them, Max's puppies, now grown and healthy, watched the scene with curiosity. "You see that container?" Jack pointed. "We used to have problems with rats. Since these dogs started frequenting the market, we haven't seen a single one. They keep the area clean of pests and protect the businesses at night." Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from her flower stand, approached with her phone in hand. "And I have videos that prove it. Last week, these dogs prevented a robbery at Mr. Johnson's vegetable stand." Other merchants began to approach, each with their own story about how the dogs had benefited the market. The official listened with growing interest, while Richard Walker became increasingly nervous. "This is ridiculous," the businessman finally blurted out. "A market can't depend on stray dogs for its security." "Why not?" intervened Mr. Johnson, who had just arrived. "Would you prefer we depend on people like you who organize illegal dogfights?" The silence that followed was deafening. The official looked at Richard with new eyes, while he visibly paled. "We have evidence, Mr. Johnson continued, taking an envelope from his apron. "Photographs of your training facilities. The police will be very interested in seeing them." Richard Walker stepped back, but found himself surrounded by the market merchants. His facade of a respectable businessman was crumbling by the moment. "This isn't over," he threatened, before hurriedly leaving the alley, followed by his companions. The official stayed behind, thoughtfully observing the scene before her. The United Merchants, the vigilant dogs, and Max, who had returned to Jack's side. "Mr. Miller," she finally said, "I think we need to rethink this case. Perhaps, instead of seeing this as a sanitary problem, we should consider it as a pilot project of community integration and animal protection." As the woman walked away, promising to return with a more constructive proposal, Jack crouched down to pet Max. The dog looked at him with those wise eyes that seemed to contain all the secrets of the market. But Richard Walker's threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Everyone knew that a man like that, cornered and exposed, could be more dangerous than ever. The real battle was just beginning. The next morning dawned with news that shook the entire market. During the night, someone had tried to set fire to the abandoned park where Max kept his puppies. Fortunately, the quick action of the neighbors and a sudden rain had prevented a major tragedy. Jack arrived at the scene as soon as he received the call from Mrs. Thompson. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and the scorch marks on some trees evidenced how close they had been to disaster. Max and his puppies were safe, sheltered in the basement of the flower shop. While inspecting the damage, Jack found something that chilled his blood: a partially burned old photograph deliberately left next to the jacaranda tree. It showed his grandfather, Anthony, along with a group of people in front of the original shelter decades ago. On the back, written in recent handwriting, "History has a way of repeating itself." "It wasn't an accidental fire," declared the firefighter, investigating the scene. "We found traces of accelerant at several strategic points. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." Mr. Johnson, who had arrived shortly after, took Jack by the arm and led him aside. "There's something you should know," the old man said gravely. "Your grandfather faced something similar 40 years ago. They tried to burn down the original shelter." The revelation hit Jack like lightning. "Why was I never told?" "Your father wanted to protect you," Mr. Johnson replied. "After what happened with your grandfather, what exactly happened?" The old grocer looked around, making sure no one else could hear. "Your grandfather discovered that some local businessmen were using the shelter as a front for smuggling. When he confronted them, they tried to destroy the place. Captain, his dog, was the one who raised the alarm and saved many animals that night." Jack was processing this information when his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "The past and present intertwine. Ask Mrs. Garcia about the black box." "Mrs. Garcia?" Jack asked aloud. Mr. Johnson paled. "Mary Garcia? I haven't heard that name in years. Her husband was your grandfather's partner. She still lives in the blue house near the church." Without wasting time, Jack headed to the indicated address. The blue house, although deteriorated by time, maintained an air of old elegance. An elderly woman with white hair and lively eyes greeted him at the door. "I've been expecting you," she said simply. "Since that dog appeared in the market, I knew it was time." In her living room, surrounded by old photographs and memories, Mrs. Garcia took out a black box from a cabinet. "Your grandfather and my Edward trusted that someday someone would continue their work, not just the shelter, but the true mission." Inside the box were documents, photographs, and a detailed diary. The pages revealed a network of corruption that extended back decades, involving powerful families that still controlled part of the city. "Richard Walker is nothing but a pawn," explained the old woman. "The real power is behind, in the same families that tried to destroy the shelter 40 years ago. Your grandfather and my Edward began to document everything, but what? The night of the fire, Edward disappeared. Days later, they found his body in the river. The police classified it as an accident." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The story was not only repeating itself, it had never really ended. "Why Max?" he finally asked. "Why now?" Mrs. Garcia smiled mysteriously. "Dogs have always been the guardians of this place. Captain wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol of resistance. And now Max, doesn't his resemblance seem more than coincidence to you?" As he returned to the market, Jack noticed he was being followed. A black car, different from Richard's, kept its distance. The game had begun, and the pieces were moving on a much larger board than he had imagined. At the butcher shop, Max was waiting for him. His eyes, wiser than ever, seemed to say, "Now you understand. The real battle is just beginning." Mrs. Garcia's revelation had opened a Pandora's box that could no longer be closed. Over the following days, Jack immersed himself in the diary's documents, uncovering an intricate network of connections that spread like cobwebs throughout the city. On a particularly cold morning, as he organized the documents in the back room of his butcher shop, he received an unexpected visit. A young journalist, Laura Peterson, introduced herself with a folder under her arm and a determined look. "Mr. Miller," she began, "I've been investigating the story of your grandfather and the market for months. There are things you need to know." Laura spread out a series of photographs and old newspaper clippings on the counter. "Do you see this man next to your grandfather?" She pointed to an elegant man in one of the photos. "That's Frank Walker, Richard's father." "Richard's father?" "Exactly. But there's more." Laura pulled out another document. Frank Walker wasn't just a business partner of the families mentioned in Edward Garcia's diary. He was the main liaison with local politicians for money laundering operations, using commercial properties as a front. As they talked, Max, who had been dozing in a corner, suddenly stood up, alerting both of them. Seconds later, they heard footsteps at the back entrance. "Quick, the documents," Laura whispered, helping Jack to put everything away. The door burst open, revealing two men in suits. One of them, the taller one, smiled coldly. "Miss Peterson, what a surprise to find you here," he said in a soft but threatening voice. "My client will be very interested to know that you're still investigating." Laura paled but maintained her composure. "Mr. Torres, the public has a right to know the truth." "The truth," Torres scoffed, "is a very relative concept, don't you think?" Max positioned himself between the intruders and Jack, growling softly. The second man took a step back, nervous. "Control your dog, Miller," Torres warned. "It would be a shame if the health authorities had to intervene because of an aggressive animal." At that moment, a commotion was heard outside. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Thompson and other merchants had noticed the presence of the strangers and were approaching as a group. "Everything all right, Jack?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice firm despite his age. Torres assessed the situation and with a final threatening look gestured to his companion to retreat. "This isn't over," he muttered as he passed by Laura. When they left, Laura collapsed into a chair, shaking. "They've been following me since I started investigating the connections between the Walkers and the properties in the historic downtown." "Why risk so much?" Jack asked. Laura pulled an old photograph from her bag. In it, a young woman smiled next to Edward Garcia. "She was my aunt," she explained. "She disappeared the same night as Mr. Garcia. They never found her body." The silence that followed was interrupted by Max, who approached Laura and rested his head on her lap, as if understanding her pain. "Dogs always know," Mrs. Thompson commented, who had remained at the door. "Your grandfather used to say they have a sixth sense for recognizing kind souls." That night, after closing the market, Jack, Laura, and the oldest merchants gathered at the flower shop. It was time to plan their next move. "We can't confront them directly," Laura warned. "They're too powerful. We need to be smarter." "Perhaps," Mr. Johnson intervened. "The answer lies in the past, in what your grandfather and Edward Garcia discovered." As they discussed strategies, Max remained alert, his eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the shadows lengthened and the city prepared for the night. Somewhere, in elegant offices and boardrooms, other meetings were taking place, other plans were being drawn up. The battle for Green Street Market had entered a new phase, and no one could predict how it would end. The next morning dawned with unexpected news. The city's major newspapers published an extensive report on irregularities in the real estate development of the historic downtown. Laura had managed to leak part of her investigation through trusted colleagues. The article, although not directly mentioning the Walkers, left clear clues about the corruption network that had extended for decades. The reaction was immediate. The butcher shop's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from journalists and curious onlookers. "It's just the first step," Laura explained during an impromptu meeting in the back room. "Now we need people to connect the dots." As they discussed the next moves, Max suddenly became alert. Seconds later, a familiar figure appeared at the door, Mrs. Garcia holding a rusty metal box. "I found this last night," she said without preamble. "Edward hid it in our garden shortly before disappearing. I never dared to open it until now." With trembling hands, Jack and Laura helped open the box. Inside they found photographs, notarized documents, and most surprisingly, an old dog collar with an engraved tag, "Captain, Guardian of Green Street Market." "Look at this," Laura pointed out, holding a series of photographs. They showed clandestine meetings, briefcase exchanges, and names and dates noted on the back. "Edward was smarter than they thought," Mrs. Garcia smiled proudly. "He knew that someday these proofs would be necessary." As they examined the documents, Mr. Johnson, who had been unusually quiet, approached the window. "We have company," he murmured. Several black cars had parked in front of the market. Richard Walker and Torres descended from them, accompanied by a group of menacing-looking men. "Mr. Miller," Richard's voice resonated through the almost empty market, "I think it's time we have a definitive conversation." Max positioned himself in front of the butcher shop door, his posture tense but controlled. Other dogs from the market, as if responding to an invisible signal, began to appear from different corners. "You don't have to make this harder," Richard continued. "Development is inevitable. Progress can't be stopped." "You call destroying the city's heritage progress," Laura responded, coming out to confront them with her recorder in hand. "Eliminating history and culture for a few glass buildings." Richard paled upon seeing the journalist. "Miss Peterson, I see you're still sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "On the contrary," a new voice intervened. Everyone turned to see a group of people approaching from the main entrance of the market. At the front, a middle-aged woman with an official badge. "I'm the special prosecutor against corruption, and I think we have a lot to talk about." Panic was reflected in the faces of Richard and his companions. Torres tried to step back, but found himself surrounded by police officers who had appeared silently. "Edward Garcia's photographs have been in our possession for weeks," explained the prosecutor. "We just needed you to make a mistake, like trying to intimidate a journalist in public." As the officers proceeded with the arrests, Max approached Jack and rested his head against his leg. In his eyes shone something that seemed like satisfaction. "You know something funny?" Mrs. Garcia commented, observing the scene. "Today is the anniversary of the market's foundation, the same day Captain first appeared so many years ago. The coincidences seemed too perfect to be casual. As the detainees were escorted out of the market, a soft breeze moved the leaves of the old jacaranda tree, as if history itself sighed in relief. But this victory, although significant, was only the beginning of a new era for Green Street Market and its guardians. In the weeks following the arrests, Green Street Market became the epicenter of a transformation that no one had anticipated. The story of Max, the unveiled corruption, and the community's resistance had captured the public's imagination. Tourists and locals alike flocked in droves, eager to meet the famous guardian dog and hear the stories firsthand. The market stalls, which had previously struggled to stay afloat, now bustled with activity. Jack, turned into a kind of reluctant local celebrity, found himself leading guided tours that recounted the history of the market and his grandfather. Max, true to his nature, accompanied each tour, keeping a watchful eye on the visitors. One sunny morning, as Jack prepared the butcher shop for another busy day, he received an unexpected visit. The special prosecutor, accompanied by a team of urban planners and conservationists, entered with a proposal that would change everything. "Mr. Miller," the prosecutor began, "the Walker case has opened the eyes of many in the government about the importance of preserving our cultural heritage. We want to propose Green Street Market as a pilot project for responsible urban renewal." The plan was ambitious: restore the market while maintaining its historical essence, implement sanitary measures that would allow safe coexistence with animals, and expand the old shelter in the abandoned park, turning it into a community center and animal adoption facility. "Additionally," added one of the urban planners, "we want to integrate the story of Max and Captain into the design, a living reminder of resistance and loyalty." The news spread like wildfire through the market. The merchants, initially skeptical after decades of unfulfilled promises, gradually caught the enthusiasm. Laura, who had been instrumental in exposing the truth, now led a documentation project, collecting oral histories from the oldest merchants and their families. "We're preserving more than buildings," she explained to her team. "We're saving the collective memory of this place." The project was not without challenges. Some neighbors feared that the influx of visitors would disrupt the tranquility of the neighborhood. Others questioned the practicality of keeping animals in a commercial environment. It was then that Max, once again, proved to be more than just a dog. During a tense community meeting, where voices were raised in disagreement, the dog stood up and walked calmly among the attendees, stopping in front of each one, as if inviting them to calm down and reflect. "It's as if he understands everything that's at stake," Mrs. Thompson murmured, observing the scene. Max's presence seemed to change the tone of the discussion. Little by little, objections gave way to constructive proposals. The community began to see the project not as an imposition, but as an opportunity to shape their own future. Months later, Green Street Market reopened its doors, renovated but maintaining its spirit intact. The old park, now turned into a beautiful animal shelter, bustled with life. Families strolled among the stalls, children played with the rescued dogs, and the old merchants proudly shared their stories. In the center of the market, a bronze statue forever captured the image of a young man, Anthony Miller, alongside two identical dogs, Captain and Max. The plaque read, "To the guardians of Green Street Market, past and present, may their loyalty and courage inspire future generations." Jack, observing the scene from his renovated butcher shop, felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Max, by his side, as always, rested his head on his hand. "We did it, friend," Jack murmured. "But something tells me our story is just beginning." And as if fate wanted to confirm his words, the doorbell rang. A young couple entered, leading a puppy on a leash that was the spitting image of Max. "Excuse me," said the man. "We were told that here we could learn about the history of the market and its guardian dogs. Could you tell us?" Jack smiled, exchanging a knowing look with Max. The story indeed continued. 5 years had passed since the reopening of Green Street Market. What began as a renovation project had become a model of sustainable urban development and cultural preservation, replicated in other parts of the city and even in other countries. It was a warm spring afternoon when Jack, now with some grey hair sprinkling his head, sat on the bench in front of the statue of his grandfather and the guardian dogs. Max, aged but still alert, rested at his feet. The market bustled with activity, a perfect blend of the old and the new. Laura, who had become a renowned documentarian, approached with a smile. "Ready for the big reveal?" Jack nodded, a mixture of anticipation and nostalgia in his gaze. That night, the documentary Laura had been preparing for years would premiere, narrating the complete history of Green Street Market, from its beginnings to its rebirth. As they walked towards the old park, now a thriving animal shelter and community center, Jack reflected on all that had changed. The market had not only survived, but had become the beating heart of the neighborhood. "Remember when all of this seemed impossible?" Laura asked, gesturing around them. Jack smiled. "Every day, but Max always seemed to know we'd make it." Upon reaching the center of the park, where a giant screen had been set up for the premiere, they found a crowd waiting. Everyone was there: Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Garcia, merchants, neighbors, and even the former special prosecutor, now mayor of the city. The documentary began with black and white images of the original market, Laura's voice narrating the story of Anthony Miller and Captain. As it progressed, tracing the years of struggle, corruption, and finally redemption, Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. When the first images of Max appeared, a murmur ran through the audience. The dog, as if understanding that he was being talked about, sat up straighter next to Jack. At the end of the documentary, with an aerial shot of the renovated market, the silence gave way to thunderous applause. Tears, laughter, and hugs mingled among the attendees. The mayor approached the microphone. "Tonight," she began, "we're not just celebrating a documentary or a market. We're celebrating the power of community, the importance of our roots, and the strength that is born when we unite for a just cause." Then, to everyone's surprise, she announced, "It is an honor to inform you that Green Street Market has been declared a World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO, recognizing not only its historical value, but its innovative model of preservation and community development." The ovation that followed was deafening. Jack, overwhelmed, felt Max gently tugging at his pants. As he looked down, he saw the dog pointing with his muzzle towards the park entrance. There, bathed in the light of the setting sun, were Max's puppies, now adult dogs, each accompanied by a family from the neighborhood, and among them, to Jack's amazement, a new puppy identical to Max and Captain in their early days. "Life finds its way," Mrs. Garcia murmured, who had silently approached. "Your grandfather used to say that as long as there was love and loyalty in this place, there would always be a guardian." That night, as the celebration continued, Jack found himself once again in front of the statue. Max sat beside him, and for a moment, in the gleam of his eyes, Jack thought he saw a flash of something older and wiser than just a dog. "Thank you," he whispered, stroking Max's head, "for everything." The dog barked softly, as if responding. And in that instant, Jack understood that the true magic of Green Street Market wasn't in the buildings or in the historical documents, but in the invisible bonds that united people and animals across generations. The legacy of Anthony Miller, of Captain, of Max, and of all who had fought to preserve this corner of the city would live forever. And as long as there were hearts willing to protect and love, there would always be a guardian watching over the market and its people. Jack looked to the future with hope, knowing that although times would change, the spirit of Green Street Market would remain eternal.